I'm Georges Simenon. Welcome to my new case.
The evening had settled into that comfortable grey that made the lamps on Boulevard Richard-Lenoir look closer than they were. Maigret watched them from the kitchen while his wife rinsed chicory from the filter and set the pot to gurgle. It was the sort of damp that collects on the windows and blurs everything into a patient softness. He had left his coat on the peg. The collar still smelled of wet wool. The telephone had not rung all day. He did not mind. There are days when Paris asks you to wait. Madame Maigret moved about without hurry. She had a way of placing things on the table that seemed to quiet the room. The small plate with the sugar lumps, the 2 heavy cups, the folded napkin she always laid by his left hand, though he rarely used it. She talked of a neighbor's daughter who had married a bookbinder from Choisy-le-Roi, and of a butcher who had finally retired after the influenza. It was not conversation so much as the warm air that lives in a kitchen. It took the edge off the damp. Lognon telephoned after lunch, she said, as if it were a detail about onions. He sounded gloomy, even for him. He's a man who trusts his own gloom more than he trusts the weather, Maigret said, looking at the steam rise in a straight line before it broke against the cold glass. What did he want? He asked if you were in. I said you were at the office. He muttered something about clocks, or perhaps it was cloaks. Blisters. It was a bad line. Clocks, Maigret repeated without curiosity, but the word stayed like a spot on the window you can't wipe away. What hour was that? Around 2. He did not ask you to call back. He sounded as though he regretted having spoken at all. That would be like him, Maigret said. He drank, and the warmth settled low in his chest. A boy ran past outside, his wooden shoes finding the wet patches with the eagerness of boys. The concierge across the way dragged a mop and left a clean, dark path that would be dirty by morning. Somewhere, a radio played a waltz that seemed aware of the rain and kept itself small. Maigret had slept badly the night before. He did not know why. Sometimes it was a smell from the street, coal, cabbage water, something from the canal that turned in his head until dawn. Sometimes it was nothing at all. Today his bones felt thick. He had read the morning papers without seeing the words, then sat at the office and pretended to read yesterday's reports until the clock on the mantel changed its throat and struck. He had gone to see a man who had stopped beating his wife. He had stopped because he had found someone else to beat. These were the kinds of victories that filled the notebooks. Do you want more? Madame Maigret asked. No, he said, but he held out his cup and she gave him a little, the way she always did when he said no. He listened to the rain. It wasn't heavy. It was the sort that changes nothing and yet makes everything slower. He thought of Lognon's voice, which could take a sunny room and pull the curtains. Clocks, clocks. He pictured both and found neither pleasant. He rubbed the curve of his pipe with his thumb without lighting it. He liked the feel of the smooth wood. He liked the restraint of not striking a match. You're not going back tonight, she asked. I don't think so, he said, unless the telephone remembers us. She smiled in that tolerant way she had, which said she knew that his life was a thing that could tip for a button found in an ashtray or a slip of a girl's lie. She did not complain. He loved her for that. He loved the quiet way she put the sugar back in the cupboard and straightened the cloth, as if the world could be kept in order if one simply insisted. They ate a simple supper. He cut his bread with the old knife that always left a slightly ragged edge. She had made a stew that had waited all afternoon and was better for the waiting. The steam carried the smell of pepper and bay, and for a while the rain was only a sound that made the warmth inside more definite. When they finished, he sat with a cigarette between his fingers, unlit, and watched the window as if it might speak. At 8:15, there was a faint tapping. Not the telephone. A neighbor. It was the kind of sound that could be anything. A spoon against a pot, a shutter with a loose hook. He didn't move. Then the tapping came again, more definite. Madame Maigret looked at him, and he rose, heavy, without haste. It was the boy from upstairs, the one with the careful hair, whom Madame liked because he always said bonsoir. He held his cap in both hands and stood on the mat, bringing in damp air. "Monsieur le Commissaire, I'm sorry," the boy said. "A man telephoned. I was with my cousin in the concierge's lodge. She asked me to come up and say. He asked for you. He said he would try again in 5 minutes. He sounded..." The boy searched for a word and failed. "Did he give a name?" "No, monsieur, only that he would try again." "Thank you," Maigret said, and he gave the boy a coin he would not have accepted if it had been larger. He closed the door and went to the telephone as a man goes to the window when he already knows the street is empty. Madame Maigret did not speak. They both listened to the silent machine with the same respectful patience one gives to a teapot just before it boils. The ring came, then, abrupt, almost embarrassed. He lifted the receiver. "Maigret," he said. There was a breath. Then a voice he did not know, cultivated but frayed at the edges. "I'm sorry to disturb you at home, Monsieur le Commissaire. It's not... If I had any sense, I'd have dialed the wrong number. But there's a room, you see. A room with 2 clocks. 2 clocks?" he said, not because it mattered, but because it had already been said in his kitchen. "Yes. Odd, isn't it? I thought so at first, too. One above the mantel and one on the opposite wall. They do not tell the same time. They are not even trying. I think that's the point. I thought it was amusing this afternoon. I don't find it amusing now. Where are you calling from?" The line burred. He imagined the man in a telephone booth with a wet sleeve, or in a hallway where the wallpaper had peeled at the edges. The voice came back softer. "From near the Rue Oberkampf. I'm not drunk. I'm not hysterical. There's a woman on the floor who doesn't need the doctor. I keep looking at the clock so I won't look at her." "You've called the doctor?" "I told you," the man said, and Maigret heard the swallow, the way one swallows against bile. "She doesn't need one." "Your name?" Another small silence, like a door that almost closes and then does not. "You don't know me," the man said, "and I would be grateful later if you never did. I will tell you the number on the door. It is not mine. It is not hers either." "Tell me," Maigret said, and he wrote it on the corner of a newspaper. The ink made a small fuzzy halo where the paper had taken on damp. When he had the address and the line had gone quiet, with the little respectful click of a receiver put down gently, Maigret remained as he was, bent over the table. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't need to. He knew she would have his coat already, her hand inside the lining to straighten the sleeve before he put his arm through. "At this hour?" she asked, not complaining, a fact among facts. "At this hour," he said. He found his hat with the small indentation his thumb always found, and he slipped the pipe into his pocket, unlit. He would not need it in the rain. He only liked to know it was with him. "Rue Oberkampf," she said, tasting the words. "You will take a taxi." "I'll walk a bit," he said, and they both knew that meant he would think as he went, letting the city adjust to him, or he to it. At the door he hesitated, then turned back and looked at the kitchen. The cups, the folded napkin, the warm square of light on the floor that would fade when he closed the door. He put a hand on his wife's shoulder, neither a goodbye nor a promise. Outside, the rain did not try to hide. It made small points of light on the pavements under the lamps and filled the gutters with a slow, dark ribbon that was going somewhere in no hurry. Maigret stood a moment with his collar up, feeling his shoulders accept the weight of the damp. He set off at a pace that belonged to him, not to the rain, not to the clocks. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Somewhere ahead there was a room that had taken the time out of itself and a voice that wanted to be anonymous. He had learned long ago that anonymity had its own smell, like cold iron. He could almost taste it already. At the corner he passed a cafe where the door breathed heat each time a man went in or out. The waiter polishing. Glasses glanced at him and then away. A dog shook itself and made a circle, then lay down as if it had decided the weather was a story told by old people. In the window of a second-hand shop, two pendulums swung in opposite directions, neither in time with the other, their brass moons lifting and falling like patient, disagreeing hearts. He walked on. The city listened, as it does when it senses the kind of trouble that dresses itself in ordinary clothes. Maigret turned into quieter streets where the rain drew a thin wire between lamps. He did not need the scrap in his fist. The number had already settled in his head like a tune. Rue Oberkampf received him with wet stone and a wandering draught. He paused beneath the awning of a bakery gone dark, the last brioche squatting behind fogged glass, then crossed to the doorway he wanted. The building had been respectable once and still believed it. Brass letters on the bellboard were rubbed thin by hopeful fingers. The concierge sat in her lodge shelling peas, each pea hopping into a dented pan. She wore a shawl, though the air was merely obstinate, not cold. Her hair was very neat, as if neatness kept complaint from spilling over. A little radio whispered the weather and was ignored. "You are for someone?" she asked, a doubt already in the question. "For a room," Maigret said. "Third floor left, the one with 2 clocks." She blinked as if he had named a saint from a parish she did not favor. "Ah, that. He went up not long ago, the gentleman with careful shoes. Another came earlier, thin, the kind who uses the telephone too long and says nothing useful. I told him it was no hour. He agreed and did not listen." "The number?" 32, she said, and added, not as her business. "The floorboards there complain in a language I do not care for." He climbed, letting his breath settle. On the second landing, the wallpaper showed the ghost of flowers washed out by years of damp. An umbrella stood open to dry, its ribs a small, broken tent. At 32, he listened first. The silence had the texture of a room that knows it is being measured. He knocked once. A careful scrape answered, then the latch turned without hurry. The man who opened looked as if he had spent the afternoon keeping his face in order. His hair was wet and combed with fingers. His cologne was losing to rain and tobacco. He stood aside. "I hoped you would come alone," the man said. "I did not want noise." "You have me," Maigret said and stepped in. The room was long. 2 windows looked on a courtyard where rain stretched a gray skin over a puddle. The walls had known better paper. A narrow bed, a wardrobe with a mirror that made everything slightly tired, a table with a glass and an ashtray wiped too clean. The 2 clocks were impossible to ignore. One stood on the mantel, white-faced, its nickel hands halted at 11 minutes past 3. The other hung opposite in a wooden frame with a hairline cracked near the top. Its hands pointed to 20 to 8 and stayed there without apology. On the worn carpet, a woman lay on her side, not yet stiff, as though considering a nap that had betrayed her. She wore a dark dress, good material, not quite new. One shoe had fallen and lay on its flank like a listening animal. Her face turned toward the wall clock. There was no blood near her. The bruise that mattered would not be the kind to show. A handbag sat on a chair, clasped shut, respectful. "Who is she?" Maigret asked. "I don't know," the man said, truthful in shape if not in depth. "I found the door open. I was looking for someone else." "That sounds like a lie." "It is, a little. I was looking for quiet, and a light was on." "You said 2 clocks," Maigret murmured, half to himself. "Why say that?" "Because I could not look at her," the man answered, "and because it seemed like a thing that would matter to someone like you." Maigret stood very still until the room remembered its size. Water moved somewhere in the pipes in patient pulses. He crossed to the mantel and set a fingertip to the glass. Cold. The clock's key was not present. He did not touch the wall clock. He looked instead at the man's cuffs, where damp had climbed in a neat line, and at the faint smudge of face powder on the chair edge where a hand had steadied itself. "You used the telephone," he said. "Yes. I called you from the lodge. The line up here is dead." She, his glance slid toward the woman and recoiled, had not intended to make calls. There is no number on the pad. Your name, Maigret said mildly. The man studied the corridor, as if it contained a better answer. Bastien, he said at last. Luc Bastien. If I say more, I will say it badly. Badly is sometimes best, Maigret said. How did you come to this building? I meet a man on Fridays. Cards. He told me there was a room people used when they needed to be no one. I imagined a vacant place. When the door gave, I thought it was still that kind of room. Then I saw her and understood the room had chosen someone. Maigret crouched without touching the body. The stockings were new. The hem had been let down and sewn again by a careful hand. A faint violet scent clung to the dress, the kind an aunt buys from a pharmacist. On the inside of the wrist, a narrow red mark had bloomed, like a strap pulled hard and then removed. The mouth had the set of a woman who had learned to carry groceries in the rain without complaint. He nudged the fallen shoe with a knuckle. The sole was very clean, as if it had hardly met the street. You will not run, he said, still looking at her. I'm not sure I know how, Bastien answered, and it sounded almost true. Footsteps approached along the corridor, the gait of someone who preferred not to arrive. A knuckle tapped twice, timidly. The concierge's voice slipped in. Monsieur le commissaire, there is another gentleman asking for the room, the apologizing kind. He says he is late and that the clocks will blame him. Let him in, Maigret said. A man of 35 entered with the hangdog elegance of a clerk, promoted too soon. He removed his hat and twisted it by the brim. His umbrella dripped discreetly. He had the pallor of offices and a tie pinned too carefully. I'm sorry, he said before anything else. I'm always 5 minutes the wrong way. I was told there would be a meeting. Your name, Maigret said. Perret, Jules Perret. I have the key when it is my turn. He produced a small key on a ribbon and then seemed to regret it. But the door was open tonight. I thought perhaps I'd remembered the wrong day. Maigret looked from the key to Bastien and back. The two clocks ticked their disagreement. Rain wrote itself on the window in a steady, indifferent hand. He felt the case settle a little deeper around him, not heavier, only more precise, like a coat accepting shoulders. He pointed gently toward the woman. Tell me, he said, whose turn was it tonight? Perret's words hung in the room, brittle as his damp umbrella. Bastien shifted, but only enough to put his hands into his pockets as if they might stay steadier, hidden. Maigret did not speak at once. He let the silence take shape, let it wrap around all three of them until the tick of the disagreeing clocks became the only movement. The woman on the floor remained the central fact, and none of them, despite their talk, had looked her in the eye. Whose turn? Maigret asked again, softly. Perret drew a breath as though rehearsing a line and gave up halfway. Sometimes it is arranged. A man tells another that a key is waiting or that the door is left on the latch. Nothing is written. It is only said. Tonight, I believed it was mine. And yet, Maigret murmured, you found the door open. Perret nodded quickly. Yes. And I thought it strange, but I told myself someone had gone out for cigarettes. Or that it was nothing. I am foolish with explanations, monsieur. Always have been. Bastien smiled faintly, though the smile was without amusement. Foolish or convenient? He asked. Perret flushed, but his eyes fell to the carpet. He twisted his hat until its brim bent like a tired wing. I did not put her there, he said. You must believe that. Belief was not Maigret's currency. He walked to the window and pressed a palm against the cold pane, feeling the damp seep through. The courtyard below glistened, two bicycles leaning against the wall like forgotten promises. Behind him, the men waited. He could feel their patience fray. Bastien, he said, still looking outward, you said you were looking for quiet. Yet you knew the room was used for meetings. Quiet men do not wander into rooms with cards on the table. Bastien shrugged. I have my habits, commissaire. One of them is not explaining myself. Too far. If you think me guilty, say it. If not, let us both watch the rain. It was almost insolent, almost tired. Maigret turned and studied the pair of them, their shoes, their collars, their way of holding themselves in a room that was not theirs. Bastien's cuffs damp to the line, Perret's umbrella still dripping its careful rhythm. Neither had the look of men hardened for violence, but he had long since learned that violence comes in quieter packages. The concierge coughed in the corridor, unwilling to enter but unwilling to leave. Maigret opened the door a crack and asked her for a doctor. Not for hope, but for formality. She nodded and retreated with her shawl gathered, muttering about rain that never knew when to stop. Back inside, he lit his pipe at last. The smoke folded itself against the stale air, disguising nothing. He lowered himself into the single chair and tapped ash into the clean ashtray until it remembered its purpose. "You both came to this room for something it offered," he said. "You say a meeting, cards, quiet. Whatever the word, it means escape. A place where one need not be himself, and yet you find her here. That spoils the bargain." Perret lifted his head at that, as though accused of a blasphemy. "I had never seen her before," he said quickly. "Never. I swear it." "Then you will tell me who gave you the key." Perret hesitated. His mouth opened and closed. "It changes hands," he murmured. "It is never the same man twice. You pay a little or you owe a favor, and the key comes to you for an evening. There is no one name." Bastien chuckled low in his throat. "A fraternity of shadows, eh? You make it sound like poetry. In truth, it is only men too timid to take their sins home." "And you?" Maigret asked. "I am timid too," Bastien said, "but I admit it." The pipe smoke curled in slow loops. Maigret's eyes drifted to the mantel clock. 3:11, a time arrested. Then to the wall clock, 7:20, waiting without waiting. Two truths refusing to agree. He thought of Lognon's call, of Madame Maigret's sugar lumps placed quietly by his hand. Small facts, ordinary as bread, and yet all pointing here. He rose, heavy with the weight of patience. "You will both remain," he said. "The doctor will arrive, then the men from the lab. We will do what must be done. But remember this." He tapped the stem of his pipe against the mantel, near the clock that would not move. "Rooms keep secrets less well than people think, and clocks, when they disagree, tell more than the hour." Perret swallowed hard, his fingers white on the brim of his hat. Bastien only tilted his head, as if amused that the evening had chosen such company for him. The rain deepened against the windows, steady, relentless. Somewhere below, the concierge's radio whispered the forecast. Showers tomorrow, perhaps clearing by noon. Maigret listened, then looked again at the woman on the floor. Her face seemed almost at peace, as if she had known long before the two men entered that the clocks in this room would not protect her. He did not hurry. He never did. He let the silence stretch once more until the door rattled faintly under the knock of the doctor, and the story began to move from private tragedy toward the slow machinery of the law. Yet in Maigret's mind, the central question had already taken root, quiet and stubborn. Not who had killed her, but why two clocks had been needed to measure the time of her end. The doctor was a lean man with spectacles that slid down his nose whenever he bent. He knelt by the woman without needing to be told, and touched her wrist, her throat, her eyelids. His case opened with a hush of leather well used. Bastien and Perret stood off to one side, as if the doctor's presence had rendered them furniture rather than suspects. Maigret stayed near the mantel, pipe balanced between his fingers, watching not the doctor, but the faces of the two men. "She has been gone some hours," the doctor said quietly, straightening. "Perhaps since late afternoon. No marks of violence obvious, except..." He gestured at the narrow line on her wrist. "Perhaps restraint. Perhaps nothing. I will know more tomorrow." He folded her arm with careful respect. Maigret nodded. He had expected no revelation. "Thank you," he said. "The men from the lab will arrive shortly. Until then, let her be." The doctor packed his instruments, glanced once at the 2 clocks as if uncertain which hour to carry away, and left with a murmured good night. The concierge returned to her lodge, muttering about scandal in her stairwell while the rain kept up its indifferent tapping. Alone again, Maigret faced the 2 men. "You will tell me," he said, "what you did between 3 o'clock and 8. Perret answered first, eager to occupy the silence. "I left the office at 6:30. I walked from République. I stopped for a newspaper and a sandwich, which I ate standing. At 7 I came here. That is all." Bastien smiled faintly, his hands still in his pockets. "I was in a cafe on Rue de Bretagne. I drank more than was wise, though less than I might have liked. I left when it grew noisy. I wandered here at 7:30. And the woman. Both shook their heads, too quickly, like schoolboys eager to escape blame. Maigret tamped the bowl of his pipe. "You are strangers to her, both of you. Yet here you are, in the one room where she lies. Coincidence is a word I dislike." Perret licked his lips. "It is not coincidence. The room is used, yes, by many. Perhaps she was one of them." "Perhaps," Maigret said. "But the clocks trouble me. One stops at 3, the other at 20 to 8. You arrived at 7, Perret. Bastien 5:30. Yet she may have been gone since the afternoon. Tell me, why should clocks disagree in such a place?" Neither answered. The silence thickened, carrying the weight of the rain. The men from the lab arrived then, 2 inspectors with tired eyes and small suitcases of powders and brushes. They worked quietly, dusting the wardrobe, the glass, the handbag clasp. They muttered about smudges, about prints blurred by cleaning. When they finished, one shrugged. "Too clean," he said. "Someone has been careful. We have fragments, not certainty." Maigret dismissed them. He knew already the case would not yield to powders. The truth lay in gestures, in silences, in clocks that refused to agree. When the room was quiet again, he let the men sit. He poured each a glass of water from the carafe. Neither drank. He asked for their names again, their addresses, their employments. He wrote them slowly in his notebook, his heavy hand giving the words more weight than they wished to bear. Perret, clerk in an insurance office, unmarried, mother in the provinces. Bastien, salesman of unspecified goods, divorced, lodging in a hotel by the canal. Both plausible, both ordinary, yet both present in this room when they should not have been. At last he rose. "You will come with me to the Quai des Orfèvres. You are not under arrest, but you will answer questions until I am satisfied." Perret sagged as though relieved. Bastien only shrugged, the faint smile never quite leaving his mouth. They left the room together, the concierge peering after them like a cat from her lodge. The rain had not lessened. Taxis hissed by, their lamps smeared with mist. Maigret chose to walk the first stretch, collar up, the 2 men behind him like shadows that pretended to belong. He wanted the rhythm of the street to settle in his bones before the questions began. At the quay, he placed them in separate rooms. He did not hurry. He let them wait. He sat in his office with the window cracked, the smell of wet stone drifting in. He lit his pipe again, then put it out. He read the notes he had written. Clocks, 2 times, body, no blood, clean shoe, wrist mark. None of it fitted yet. He felt the shape of something beneath, like a stone underwater. At 11, he went first to Perret. The man was pale, his tie loosened, his hat on the table like a guilty accomplice. Maigret sat opposite him without speaking. He let the silence stretch until Perret shifted, his fingers twitching against the wood. "I did not know her," Perret blurted. "I swear, I came because I was told the room was mine tonight. I was told by—" He stopped, eyes wide, as if the name had been too quick to his tongue. By whom? Maigret asked gently. Perret swallowed. By a colleague, a man from the office. But I cannot give his name. It would shame him. He has a family. Yet you came, Maigret said, to a room with no name on the lease, where keys change hands like coins. You came to meet no one, and you found her. Perret lowered his head. Yes, but alive. She was not there. You must believe me. Maigret left him to his own thoughts and crossed the corridor to Bastien. The salesman sat back, arms folded, his smile still faint but less sure. You have been divorced, Maigret said. Women are not strangers to you. No, Bastien said, nor men. I sell to both. You wandered here tonight. I wander often. It is my style. And the clocks? Bastien raised an eyebrow. Perhaps one was broken, perhaps both. I did not stop them. Maigret leaned forward. But you noticed. Enough to tell me on the telephone. Why notice unless they mattered? Bastien spread his hands. Because they were odd, and odd things cling to me. That is all. Maigret studied him a long moment, then stood. You will both remain in Paris. I will know if you leave. Back in his office, he poured himself a small glass of beer. It was flat, but the bitterness cleared his throat. He thought of Madame Maigret at home, of her folded napkin waiting. He thought of the woman in the room, her shoe fallen, her wrist marked. He thought of the two clocks, stubborn in their disagreement. It was near midnight when Lognon entered, dripping and morose. So you took my case, he said gloomily. Your clocks, yes, Maigret answered. Lognon slumped into a chair. You'll see. It will be nothing. A woman who had too much, a quarrel, a mistake. Always the same. Always, Maigret said, though his mind told him otherwise. He tapped his notebook where the times still stood. 3:11, 7:40. 2 hours that would not agree, pointing at something ordinary yet stubbornly hidden. Lognon's gloom clung to the office like a damp overcoat. He sat hunched, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the rain outside had seeped into his bones. Maigret poured him a small glass from the same bottle he had tasted, and Lognon accepted it with a grunt that was neither thanks nor complaint. He drank, grimacing, then set the glass down as though the act itself had disappointed him. You see, he muttered, it's always the same. A woman, a room, a pair of men who pretend not to know her. You pull at the threads and they fall apart in your hands. Nothing but shabby lives, shabby lies. Maigret listened without answering. He had long understood that Lognon's pessimism was his armor. It was better to let him wear it than to try stripping it away. The smoke from Maigret's pipe drifted lazily across the desk, the only movement between them. He tapped ash gently into the tray, not to interrupt, but to punctuate the silence. Still, Maigret said at last, 2 clocks do not lie by chance. One stopped at 3, one at 20 to 8. Both broken, both wrong, but each wrong in its own way. That is not shabby. That is deliberate. Lognon gave a bleak smile. Or coincidence. A coincidence is always waiting, you know. Sometimes it is the only explanation left when all the clever ones fail. Perhaps, Maigret murmured. But he knew he did not believe it. Coincidences rarely announce themselves twice in the same room. The telephone rang, its jarring note cut through the quiet, and Maigret answered without haste. A constable from the neighborhood of Rue Oberkampf reported that they had spoken with tenants in the building. A woman on the second floor remembered hearing footsteps above hers around 4 o'clock, hurried, followed by the sound of water running a long time in the pipes. Another recalled a man's voice raised briefly. Then nothing. The concierge had given her version 3 times already, and each time added a different detail, none of them useful. When he hung up, Maigret rose. I will go back, he said. Lognon frowned. Tonight? Tonight, Maigret said, putting on his coat. The rain has not stopped, and neither has the clock in my head. He left the quay and walked slowly through the city, the lamps reflected on the wet stones, the smell of cabbage and coal smoke seeping from basement windows. At a café near République, he paused to light his pipe. Inside, clerks hunched over Pernots, and two girls laughed too loudly, their stockings damp at the ankles. Ordinary lives, all running their small courses, while a woman lay silent in a room with two clocks. When he reached Rue Oberkampf, the concierge had half dozed in her chair. She startled awake at his shadow. "Again, Monsieur le Commissaire," she said, gathering her shawl. "Again," he said. "Tell me something. Did the lady live here?" The concierge shook her head firmly. "No, not her. I know all the faces. She was not one of mine." "And the men? Perret, Bastien?" "They come and go. They do not belong either. But this is Paris. Someone always finds a key." He climbed back to the third floor. The door of 32 had been sealed with official wax, but he opened it with the authority of his own hand. The room smelled faintly now of chemicals from the lab, overlying the ghost of violets from the woman's dress. The clocks waited as before, one defiant at 3:11, the other stubborn at 7:40. He walked to the mantel. The clock there was wound tightly, not exhausted. Someone had stopped it with intent. He studied the small metal hand, the way it quivered against the dial, frozen mid-motion. Across the room, the wall clock sagged on its nail. He lifted it down carefully. The mechanism had been tampered with, the pendulum stilled by a wedge of paper shoved discreetly between gears. He unfolded the scrap. It was part of a letter, the writing hurried, slanted, feminine. A few words remained. "Tuesday. Not again. You promised." He placed the clock back and stood very still. A promise broken, a Tuesday, two clocks stopped like witnesses forced into silence. When he left the room, the concierge was waiting, restless. She tugged at her shawl and spoke low, as if afraid the stairwell might hear her. "Monsieur, there is something. A woman came yesterday afternoon before the rain. She asked for the room. I told her it was not available, but she smiled as if she knew better. I thought nothing of it. I see so many. But now," she trailed off. "Describe her." "Tall, not young, not old. A scarf with flowers. She walked as though she had an appointment she disliked." Maigret nodded. It was not much, but it was something. He asked her to find the scrap of paper from the rubbish if she still had it. She promised, though her eyes showed doubt. Back at the quay, near 2 a.m, he wrote his notes. A woman unknown, but expected. A letter fragment with a promise broken. 2 clocks deliberately silenced at 2 different hours. Perret, timid, with his office life and his careful lies. Bastien, careless, smiling at shadows, both in the wrong place. He leaned back in his chair. Outside, the river shifted under the bridges, heavy and dark. He thought of Madame Maigret, asleep at home, her quiet presence keeping the kitchen warm even in her dreams. He thought of the dead woman, her shoe fallen, her life caught between 2 disagreeing hours. He did not feel triumph nor despair, only the patience that had always been his weapon. He would wait, he would watch, and in their silences the men would betray themselves. For guilt was never clever. It was only human, and sooner or later it revealed itself in the small ways, the glance, the hesitation, the word repeated once too often. The night deepened. Maigret closed his notebook, placed his pipe carefully beside it, and allowed himself a long breath. Tomorrow, the clocks would speak more loudly. Morning came with a pale, watery light that turned the Seine into a dull strip of pewter. Maigret had not slept. He had dozed briefly in the chair, his heavy head nodding forward, then jerked awake with the smell of pipe ash clinging to his coat. By the time the clerks began arriving at the quay, he had washed his face in cold water and sent for coffee that tasted of burnt chicory. The taste steadied him. He looked at the note again, the scrap of paper pulled from the wall clock, the hurried feminine hand that had written of Tuesday and promises not kept. He read it until the words lost meaning and became merely shapes. By 10 o'clock, Perret and Bastien were brought back to his office. They had spent the night in separate rooms, each with his own silence. Perret looked grayer, as if the hours had drained him. Bastien still had the faint smile, though it seemed pasted on, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Maigret let them stand before the desk. Neither offered a chair. "You will listen," he said, "and you will correct me if I am wrong. Yesterday, a woman came to the room. She expected someone. She had a key, or believed she would find the door open. She brought a letter, perhaps unfinished, perhaps to be delivered. She waited. What she received instead was silence, and then death." Perret stirred, his lips parting, but Maigret raised a hand and continued. "At some hour, 3 o'clock perhaps, someone chose to stop a clock. Not to mark the time of her death, but to confuse it. At another hour, nearly 5 hours later, another clock was silenced with a scrap of her own letter. 2 gestures, deliberate, meant to spoil the truth. That is not shabby accident. That is intent." Bastien leaned back against the wall, folding his arms. "And which of us, commissaire, has such intent?" he asked. "That is what I will know," Maigret replied, "when I learn whose promise she carried." He dismissed them again, sending Perret to a clerk for formal deposition, leaving Bastien in a smaller room with nothing but a wooden bench. He wanted them to simmer, each in his own way. Then he walked out into the courtyard, lit his pipe, and watched the drizzle that had returned. Paris in the rain always spoke to him more than Paris in the sun. People showed their truths when wet. They hurried or they lingered. They bent their heads or defied the weather. He thought of the unknown woman's face, still turned toward the wall clock, as though she had died listening to its silence. By noon, a report arrived from the lab. The mark on her wrist was from a strap or narrow belt. No alcohol in the blood, no trace of sleeping powder. Cause of death, likely strangulation, though without rope burns. Perhaps a scarf, perhaps hands. The doctor wrote cautiously. But Maigret knew. A quiet killing, intimate, carried out without noise. He closed the folder and thought of Bastien's easy smile, of Perret's shrinking voice. He sent for Madame Maigret's lunch, carried in a parcel from home. She had prepared a small pot of veal stew, wrapped neatly, and a note in her round hand. "Do not forget to eat. You grow gloomy when you do not." He smiled faintly, warmed by her foresight. He ate slowly, letting the flavors steady him, and all the while his mind circled the 2 clocks. In the afternoon, he returned to Rue Oberkampf. The concierge had found something in the rubbish, as he had asked. She handed him an envelope, torn, smelling faintly of violets. Inside was another fragment of the same letter. "You must come. I cannot be alone there. Tuesday is already too much." The words trembled on the page, desperate but controlled. It was her hand again, the same hurried slope. He thanked the concierge and climbed once more to the sealed door. He stood a long moment outside, not entering. He imagined the woman arriving, scarf with flowers, her step uncertain. He imagined her waiting, watching the clocks, hearing footsteps on the stairs. He pictured her writing, folding, perhaps tearing the letter before deciding what to say. He pictured her ending on the floor, her shoe fallen. Back at the quay, he placed the 2 fragments together. The story of a promise broken was taking shape. Someone had lured her there, or someone she expected had failed to appear. He thought again of Perret's hesitation, the name caught in his throat. He summoned him once more. Perret entered nervously, hat in his hands. Maigret let him stand again. "Who gave you the key?" he asked. Perret's lips trembled. "I told you, it changes hands." "Not always," Maigret interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He slid the fragments of the letter across the desk. She wrote these. She expected someone on Tuesday. A promise. A man she trusted enough to meet her in that room. "Was it you?" Perret recoiled as though struck. His face blanched, then flushed. "No, not me. I swear it. I would not." "But you know who," Maigret said quietly. "It is written on your face as plainly as in her hand." Perret's fingers twisted the brim of his hat until it bent almost in half. "If I tell you, I ruin a man," he whispered. "You ruin him more by silence," Maigret answered. "The clock's already accused. They are waiting." For a long moment, the office held nothing but the faint hum of the river beyond. Then Perret spoke, voice breaking. "It was not for me. It was for my superior, Monsieur Varenne at the insurance office. He used me as his errand boy, his shield. I was to hold the key, to pass it, to say nothing. She was his mistress, not mine. Yesterday she begged him to come. He promised, and he feared she would make a scene. He sent me to keep her calm. I could not. When I arrived, she was already..." His words dissolved, his body sagging. Maigret listened without movement. Varenne. A name at last. An ordinary man with a desk and a title, hiding his affairs behind subordinates. A woman waiting, betrayed, dead on the floor of a rented room. He felt no triumph, only the slow confirmation of what he had always known. Behind the respectable facades, the same small tragedies repeated themselves. When Perret finished, Maigret dismissed him with a weary wave. Alone again, he lit his pipe and leaned back. Outside, the drizzle had become rain once more, steady, unremarkable. He thought of the two clocks, each silenced to tell a different lie. One marked the hour of betrayal, the other the hour of discovery. Between them lay the woman's end, and the secret of a man who had promised too much. Maigret sat for a long while after Perret's confession, letting the words settle, testing them for weight. The name Varenne had surfaced with the inevitability of oil on water. Not forced, not invented, but rising from Perret's timidity like a bubble too long suppressed. Maigret tamped his pipe with slow fingers, his gaze heavy on the window where the rain blurred the outlines of the bridges. He thought of Varenne at his desk, pen scratching on forms, the careful tie, the polished shoes, the smile to clients. A man who had mastered respectability so thoroughly that even his sins wore cuffs and collars. He summoned Lognon, who entered still damp from the morning, his hat dripping indignation. "You want me to fetch this Varenne?" he asked gloomily, as though already predicting failure. "Not fetch. Watch," Maigret said. "Go to the insurance office. See how he behaves. Speak to no one, but observe everything. The hour he arrives, the faces he greets, the way his hands move when he thinks no one is looking. He will betray himself, if only in small ways." Lognon grumbled but obeyed, lumbering out with the air of a man condemned to catch a cold for nothing. Maigret smiled faintly at his retreating back. Lognon's gloom was useful. It disarmed people, made them careless in their pity for him. Alone again, Maigret reviewed the details. A woman, unnamed still, but connected to Varenne. A letter of desperation, torn and hidden in a clock. A promise made and broken, 2 times marked, 2 lies. Perret's role was clear enough, the errand boy, the shield. Bastien's role remained murkier, though Maigret suspected it was less important than Bastien liked to believe. Some men drift into cases not by design, but by gravity, drawn by places where secrets gather. By late afternoon, Lognon returned. His coat was wetter, his mood darker. "I watched him," he said, dropping heavily into the chair. "He arrived at 10 precisely. He greeted the clerks with a smile, nodded to the typists, kissed one hand he ought not to have kissed. He spent the morning signing papers, then left at noon for a restaurant. He ordered fish. He smiled too much at the waiter. He looked over his shoulder twice, once in the street, once in the lavatory. I saw him wipe his forehead with a handkerchief that had initials. A.V., embroidered, very tidy. He is guilty of something, but perhaps not of murder. Perhaps, Maigret said, though he knew better. Guilt did not always shout its name. Sometimes it whispered in habits, in glances. He leaned back, considering. Tomorrow we will ask him gently. For now, let him believe he is safe. That evening, Maigret walked home through the drizzle. Madame Maigret had soup waiting, thick and fragrant. She looked at him with quiet worry, but asked nothing. He ate slowly, grateful for her silence. Later, with his slippers on and pipe lit, he told her only that a woman had been found, and that men were lying, as men always did. She nodded, folded his newspaper, and remarked that rainwater had begun leaking near the window in the bedroom. Small domestic troubles balanced the weight of larger ones. The next morning, Varenne was summoned to the quay. He arrived promptly, hat in hand, polished shoes glistening with a fresh shine, his gray suit impeccable. He had the air of a man accustomed to authority, but not accustomed to suspicion. He greeted Maigret with politeness that leaned toward condescension. "You wish to see me, commissaire? I am told it concerns an unfortunate woman." "Yes," Maigret said simply. He gestured to the chair. "Please sit." Varenne sat with the ease of one who believes chairs are made for him. His hands rested on his knees, fingers neat, nails clean. His eyes were steady too, steady. "You knew her," Maigret said. It was not a question. Varenne blinked once, slowly. "I know many. My profession requires it." "She waited for you," Maigret said, sliding the fragments of the letter across the desk. "She wrote this. She expected you Tuesday. She begged you to come. She reminded you of your promise." For the first time, the mask shifted. Varenne's lips pressed tight, then relaxed. He adjusted his cufflink, a gesture too rehearsed. "I do not know this writing," he said, though the words lacked force. "She died in a room with 2 clocks," Maigret continued, his tone quiet, almost conversational. "One stopped at 3, one at 7:40. Both silenced deliberately. Between them, her life ended. She wore a violet scent. She had a scarf with flowers. She trusted you enough to wait. You trusted her enough to send Perez in your place. Why did you not go yourself?" Varenne's composure cracked further. He shifted in his chair, his handkerchief emerging to blot a brow that glistened though the office was cool. "She was difficult," he murmured. "She pressed too hard. I could not risk a scene. My position, my family." "And so you sent Perret," Maigret said. "Yes," Varenne admitted, voice low. "But when he arrived, she was already gone. That is what he told me. And I believed him." "You believed him," Maigret repeated softly, "and yet you did not come to see for yourself. You let her lie there, alone, while you dined on fish and smiled at the waiter." Varenne's face flushed. "I am not a murderer," he said sharply. "No," Maigret said, almost kindly. "You are not a murderer, but you are a coward, and cowards sometimes leave room for murder to slip in." The silence thickened. Varenne's eyes dropped to the desk, to the fragments of the letter. His hands trembled once, then steadied. Maigret did not press further. He had learned that guilt often grows stronger in silence than in accusation. When Varenne left, Maigret remained by the window, pipe smoke curling against the glass. He watched the rain blur the rooftops and thought again of the woman, of her shoe fallen, of the 2 clocks disagreeing. One told the hour of betrayal, the other the hour of discovery. But somewhere between the two lay the truth, still waiting, still hidden. The afternoon drew on. the rain easing to a fine mist that left the city wrapped in a grey veil. Maigret remained by the window, pipe cooling in his hand, his thoughts circling without hurry. Varenne's denial had not surprised him. Men like Varenne rarely confessed outright. They preserved their dignity until it frayed thread by thread. Yet something in the man's composure disturbed him less than Bastien's smile, less than Perret's trembling. The truth still hovered out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue. He returned to the room where Bastien had been left waiting. The man was lounging on the bench, his posture insolent, as though time itself belonged to him. He greeted Maigret with a nod that bordered on mockery. "So, commissaire," he said, "have your clocks told you their secret yet?" Maigret lowered himself into the chair opposite, heavy but deliberate. He did not answer at once. Instead, he struck a match, lit his pipe, and filled the silence with slow curls of smoke. Bastien shifted, though only slightly. "You noticed the clocks," Maigret said finally. "More than noticed. You made certain to speak of them when you called me. Why?" "Because they were odd," Bastien replied lightly. "2 clocks, 2 times. It amused me." "You are not a man who amuses easily," Maigret said. "You are a man who observes, who collects details. But this detail you offered like a gift, almost as if you wished to be remembered for it." Bastien's smile flickered. "Perhaps I enjoy puzzles. Or perhaps," Maigret said softly, "you were afraid the wrong time would condemn you, and so you pointed it out before I could accuse." For the first time, Bastien's eyes narrowed. His hands came out of his pockets, resting flat on the bench. "Are you saying I killed her?" "I'm saying you were there before you admitted," Maigret said. The neighbors heard footsteps, water in the pipes, a man's voice raised briefly. "That was at 4. You told me you arrived at 7:30. You lied." Bastien leaned forward, his smile gone now, his voice lower. "And if I did? A man lies for many reasons. Perhaps I was with her and left before she died. Perhaps I was ashamed. That is not murder." "It is not innocence either," Maigret said. The silence returned, heavier this time. Bastien leaned back, crossing his arms, the faint smile crawling back to his lips as armor. "You will never prove it. Not with clocks and scraps of paper." Maigret rose. "Perhaps not. But men prove themselves. Always. That is the part you forget." He left Bastien and walked the corridor, his step heavy on the worn boards. He found Lognon in the outer office, gloomier than ever, a wet umbrella at his feet. "Well?" Lognon asked, as though expecting disappointment. "He was there at 4, Maigret said. "He lied. And Varenne, a coward, perhaps worse. But not with his own hands, not yet." Lognon sighed, shaking his head. "Then you have nothing." "I have patience," Maigret said. "That is usually enough." He sent Bastien home under watch, Perret likewise, Varenne to his office with the knowledge that his name had been spoken. Then Maigret returned to Rue Oberkampf once more, alone, in the fading light. The building smelled of damp stone and cabbage. The concierge gave him a nervous smile, her shawl pulled tight. He climbed to the 3rd floor and unlocked the sealed door. The room received him with silence. The clocks, useless now, seemed to watch him as he entered. He studied them again. The mantel clock wound too, tightly, the wall clock still wedged with her letter. 2 lies, deliberate, precise. He moved to the chair where her handbag still sat, tagged by the lab but unopened. He examined its contents: a small purse with coins, a powder compact, a folded handkerchief, and a photograph creased from being handled. The photograph showed the woman younger, smiling faintly, standing beside a man in front of a seaside hotel. The man was unmistakable. Varenne, though slimmer, his hair darker. He had his arm around her, awkwardly, as though unused to tenderness. Maigret held the photograph a long time. This was no passing acquaintance. This was years, promises layered on promises until they curdled. He slipped the photograph back into the bag and sat heavily on the bed. The springs creaked. He imagined her waiting there, clutching that photograph, rehearsing words she would never speak. He imagined Bastien arriving, smooth, careless, perhaps sent by Varenne to calm her, perhaps arriving of his own accord. A quarrel, a scarf, silence. Then the cowardice of stopping the clocks, trying to confuse the truth, leaving her to be found by chance. He rose slowly and closed the door behind him. The concierge was waiting on the stairs, curious eyes darting. "Monsieur le commissaire," she said softly. "Do you know her name now?" "Not yet," Maigret said, though he held the photograph in his mind. "But I will." That night, back at his desk, he wrote the name himself on the top of the file. Madame Claire Doucet. He did not know if it was correct, but it felt close. He poured himself a glass of beer, flat and bitter, and stared at the paper until the letters blurred. The clocks ticked in his head. One at 3, one at 7:40, disagreeing still. He knew they would not agree until one of the men broke, until silence gave way to the weight of its own lies. The following morning, Paris seemed scrubbed of color, the mist hanging so low it pressed against the windows of the quay. Maigret arrived earlier than usual, his pipe cold in his pocket, the taste of Madame Maigret's coffee still lingering. He carried the photograph he had found, slipped between the pages of his notebook. He had looked at it again over breakfast, the woman's guarded smile, Varenne's arm around her in that stiff way of a man uncomfortable with tenderness but unwilling to refuse it. A seaside hotel, perhaps Normandy, perhaps farther. It spoke of summers past, of secrets maintained in plain air. He summoned Perret first. The little clerk shuffled in, pale, hat clutched as though it were a talisman. Maigret showed him the photograph without a word. Perret's eyes widened, then fell. His lips moved before sound came. "Madame Doucet," he whispered, confirming the name Maigret had written the night before. "You knew her?" "Yes," Perret said, trembling. "Not personally, only through him, through Varenne. She would telephone the office sometimes. I was made to say, he was not in, though he was. Once I carried a letter to her, to an apartment near Montparnasse. She was proud, I think, but tired. I pitied her." Maigret studied him a long time. "Did you ever see them together?" "Once, in the street. She took his arm. He looked ashamed, though she did not. She seemed the braver of the two." Maigret let him go, watching his hunched figure retreat. Cowardice could take many forms, but Perret's was harmless, the timidity of a man caught between obedience and conscience. The true coward was Varenne. When Varenne arrived later, summoned under firmer terms, he looked immaculate once more, though his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. He sat when asked, legs crossed, gloves folded neatly on his knee. Maigret placed the photograph on the desk between them. Varenne glanced at it, his composure holding only a moment before his face tightened. "Where did you find this?" "In her handbag," Maigret said. "It was not hidden. She carried it because it mattered to her. You cannot deny it." Varenne's fingers twitched against the gloves. "Yes," he said finally, voice low. "It was years ago. She was my secretary once. It began then. It should have ended then too." "But it did not," Maigret said. "It lingered. She wrote to you, begged you to come. You promised. You sent Perret instead. Why?" Varenne's mouth compressed. He spoke slowly, as if tasting each word for bitterness. "Because I knew she would demand more than I could give. She wanted marriage. She threatened to speak to my wife. I could not allow it. And so you left her to wait in that room," Maigret said. "I thought she would tire of it," Varenne muttered. "I thought she would see sense. Instead, she is dead, and you sit there accusing me." "I accuse you of cowardice," Maigret said quietly. "Not yet of murder. But cowardice has its own weight. Who stopped the clocks, Varenne? Not Perret. Not the woman. Who? For the first time, Varenne faltered. His hands tightened on the gloves until the seams strained. I don't know, he whispered. But the lie lay too flat. Maigret dismissed him, letting him walk free under the watch of plainclothes men. He had no confession yet, but the walls were closing. That evening, Maigret went again to Rue Oberkampf. The concierge was waiting as though she had known he would come. She told him a neighbor on the second floor had remembered something more. A man leaving hurriedly around 4:30, hat pulled low, coat collar up. Not Bastien, not Perret. Someone broader, heavier. Maigret thanked her and climbed once more to the room. The clocks stared at him, patient. He sat in the same chair where the handbag had been, pipe unlit, listening. The silence was not empty. It was full of what had been withheld. He imagined it. Varenne, slipping in after the quarrel, after Bastien had perhaps tried and failed to calm her. Finding her dead or nearly so, panic seizing him. Stopping, the clocks to muddy the hour. Slipping out, leaving Perret to stumble into the mess later. It fitted the coward's hand, the coward's instinct. Yet still, Maigret knew Bastien's lie remained. Back at the quay, he brought Bastien in once more. This time he pressed harder, his questions circling, his silences longer. Bastien shifted under the weight, though he fought to keep his careless smile. Finally, with a shrug, he admitted he had been there earlier, around 4, as the neighbors had said. She begged me to fetch him, Bastien said, almost amused. She was desperate, poor creature. She clung to my sleeve as if I could deliver him like a parcel. I told her he would not come. She wept. I left. Alive, she was alive when I left. Why lie then? Maigret asked softly. Because desperation is ugly, Bastien replied. I did not want to be tied to it. I prefer my part in this story, small. Maigret regarded him with weary eyes. You prefer yourself small, but your smile too large. That is the trouble with men like you. Bastien said nothing more. When Maigret returned to his office, Lognon was waiting with news. Varenne's wife had quietly visited the quay, wrapped in furs, face tight. She had not asked directly, but her presence spoke volumes. She knew. Perhaps not the murder, but the affair, the promise broken. Maigret stood by the window as night fell, the city blurring into light smeared by mist. He thought of the woman, Claire Doucet, her life caught between promises and cowardice. He thought of the 2 clocks, still stopped, still disagreeing, each pointing at betrayal in its own way. He knew the truth was nearly within reach. One more silence would break, one more lie would stumble. The clocks would not agree until then, and neither would he. The following day was clearer, though the light remained thin, the kind that seems to fade as soon as it arrived. Maigret walked to the quay with his collar turned up, the photograph of Claire Doucet and Varenne folded in his pocket. The case had begun to take on its inevitable rhythm, not toward triumph, but toward the quiet, heavy truth that waited behind every lie. He knew it was near, though not yet spoken aloud. He sent for Varenne again, this time with less ceremony. The man entered stiffly, his composure cracked, the shadows beneath his eyes deeper. He sat without waiting to be asked, gloves clenched in his hands. Maigret studied him a long time before speaking. You came to the room, he said finally, without preamble. After Bastien left, you found her. Perhaps she was dead already, perhaps not. But you panicked. You stopped the clocks. One to mark the hour you first betrayed her, the other to confuse the hour you left. That is not murder in the usual sense. It is worse. It is abandonment, dressed as caution. Varenne shifted, his lips tightening. I told you I did not go, he muttered. Maigret leaned forward. His voice was calm, almost gentle. She carried your photograph, Varenne. Not from this year, not from last, but from long ago, when you were young enough to promise and old enough to know better. She wrote that Tuesday was already too much, and still you let her wait. She was not a stranger, not a passing affair. She was the one who believed you. For a moment, Varenne held his silence. Then he let out a low, bitter laugh, though there was no mirth in it. She was difficult, commissaire. She wanted more than I could give, always more. I told her it must end, but she clung like ivy. I did not kill her. I swear that. Maigret watched him, the sweat at his temple, the trembling of the gloves in his hand. Perhaps not with your hands, but your cowardice gave room for it. You knew she would not survive the waiting. Varenne stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. Enough. I will not sit here to be accused of cowardice as though it were crime. Cowardice is always crime, Maigret said softly. It leaves bodies behind. Varenne's face flushed. He turned and walked out, refusing to meet Maigret's eyes. When the door closed, Maigret sat heavily, drawing on his pipe though the match sputtered. He thought of Claire Doucet again, of her hand on Bastien's sleeve, of her eyes fixed on the clocks as though they might speak for her. She had been cornered by love, by fear, by betrayal. In the end, the silence of men had been enough to kill her. Later that afternoon, Bastien was brought once more. He swaggered in, though his smile had dulled. Maigret let him sit. You lied about the hour you arrived, Maigret said. You admit she begged you to fetch him. Did you? Bastien laughed softly. Do you think I am his errand boy? I told her what she already knew, that he would not come. She wept, yes, but women weep. Then I left. And you did not return? No, Bastien said firmly. Not I. Then who stopped the clocks? Bastien spread his hands. Perhaps she did to spite him. Perhaps another came. The world is full of perhaps. Not in my work, Maigret said. Only men, only their small cruelties. He released Bastien with a warning, knowing the man would wander, watched his careless mask growing heavier each hour. Men like him cracked not under pressure, but under boredom, when their smiles no longer fitted. By evening, reports trickled in. A neighbor had finally remembered seeing Varenne on the stairs, his hat low, his steps hurried, around 5. The detail was small, but it fit. Maigret wrote it down without triumph. The case was closing like a slow door. That night at home, he sat in the kitchen with Madame Maigret. She placed his supper before him, then sat opposite, knitting in her calm way. He ate slowly, the stew thick, the bread coarse but filling. After a time he spoke, his voice low. She waited for him, and he did not come. Bastien told her the truth, but she would not hear it. Then perhaps he tried to leave, and she clung to him. Perhaps he shook her off too roughly. When Varenne came later, he found her dead or dying. He stopped the clocks to hide the hours, to bury the cowardice beneath confusion. In the end, it was not malice, not greed. It was only weakness, and weakness killed her. Madame Maigret listened without interrupting, her needles clicking softly. When he finished, she set the knitting aside. There are worse things than malice, she said simply. He nodded. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the street glistening under the lamps. He poured himself a glass of beer and sat in silence, pipe unlit, listening to the faint ticking of their own kitchen clock. Its hands moved steadily, without lies, marking each second with indifferent truth. The next morning, he would summon Varenne again. He would not accuse, not directly. He would let the silence do its work, let the coward feel the weight of his own choices until the words came. That was always the way. Guilt spoke eventually, not because of questions, but because of silence. For now, he sat with his wife, the kitchen warm, the city quiet. He thought of Claire Doucet, of her fallen shoe, of the letter torn and hidden in a clock. He thought of the 2 times that disagreed, one forever pointing at betrayal, the other at discovery. and he thought of the small truth that bound them, a woman waiting for a promise too fragile to endure. The morning was bright but cold, the kind of Paris morning that sharpens sounds, the rattle of a cart, the echo of footsteps across the quay. Maigret sat in his office with the window cracked, a thin stream of air carrying the river's dampness inside. Varenne was brought in once more, no longer immaculate. His collar sagged, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, the neat gloves absent. He sank into the chair without being asked, and his hands clutched the armrests as though steadying himself. Maigret said nothing at first. He lit his pipe, puffed gently, and let the silence grow. Varenne shifted, tried to meet his gaze, then looked at the floor. The photograph lay on the desk between them, as it had before. Finally, Maigret spoke, voice low and steady. "She died between your promise and your absence. Bastien left her weeping. Perret never dared enter. Only you came afterward. You found her. Perhaps she was already gone. Perhaps not. But you did nothing except turn the clocks against her. One to bury the hour you failed her, the other to confuse the hour you fled." Varenne's lips trembled. He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet office. "I didn't mean for her to die," he whispered, "when I saw her. She was on the floor, her scarf twisted. I thought she had done it herself. I thought if I called for help, if I was found there, my wife, my office, everything would collapse. I couldn't. You stopped the clocks," Maigret said gently. Varenne nodded once, his shoulders sagging. "Yes, foolish. I thought if the Times disagreed, no one could prove when I had been there. It was all I could think of. I left her as if she were nothing." His voice cracked, and he lowered his head into his hands. Maigret did not move, did not offer comfort. He let the silence rest between them until Varenne's breathing steadied. Then he rose, heavy and deliberate, and rang for the clerk. Varenne was taken away without resistance, a man already hollowed out by the weight of his own cowardice. When the door closed, Maigret remained by the window, pipe smoke curling in the cold air. He thought of Claire Doucet, her photograph carried until the end, her last hours measured by clocks that lied for a man too weak to face her truth. No grand conspiracy, no monstrous evil, only ordinary cowardice, dressed in polished shoes and careful smiles. That evening at home, Madame Maigret set a plate of stew before him and spoke of the grocer's wife who had taken ill. He listened, nodding, grateful for the ordinary rhythm of her words. When she asked quietly if it was finished, he said yes, though his eyes lingered on the window where the rain had started again. Later, with his slippers on and his pipe cooling, he sat in silence while the kitchen clock ticked steadily. Unlike the two in Rue Oberkampf, it told the truth without drama, marking each second as it passed. Maigret listened, weary but calm. Another case had closed, not with triumph, but with the quiet understanding that human weakness left more victims than violence ever could. He poured himself a small glass of beer, lifted it, and let the bitter taste settle. Outside, the rain fell with the same indifference as always. Inside, the clock continued, patient and unerring, a reminder that time itself did not lie, only people did. And Maigret, as always, waited, listening, letting the silence tell him everything.